The hip hinge movement, just like the squat, is one of those movements that is in everything we're doing on a daily basis. It's really part of the squat itself. And it is so important that we learn to engage the supporting muscles of the back and core with that lower body in a way that protects the spine. This movement is done when you're washing your face in the morning. It's done at the highest level through things like the deadlift, where people are lifting hundreds and hundreds of pounds. It's suitable to absolutely everyone, and we must all learn it, because a lot of those movements that are most aggravating to your back every day are going to be movements of the hip hinge where you're just not doing it correctly. You're rounding at the lower back, as we'll touch on in a moment. So spend the necessary time to get this exercise correct, because it will really do wonders for your back health in the long term. There are two key mistakes with the hip hinge that people make. The first, very similarly like the squat, is they're actually not doing a hip hinge. They're just bending over and over again. And this is a real problem and something that needs to be eliminated, because all we're doing is compressing that same disc that's herniated, stretching those same tissues that are injured and trying to recover. We should be avoiding this at all costs. The second mistake, that is a little bit less common, is that as we go down, we lose integrity from the top part and our upper back rounds over. And that's when we're often trying to get that last extra bit of range of motion. We just lose the integrity of our erector spinae muscles and supporting muscles of the back and allow a round force to come from the upper part of the body instead. Remember, your spine is supposed to be a drawbridge with the hip hinge. It's stiff and perfect in its alignment, and we only hinge at the level of the hips. Nothing else should move. Everything else is maintained by a static isometric contraction that varies in its intensity as we go through the range of motion. The final error is more forgivable, and that is that we do something like a squat hinge. We're not really doing a hinge, we're doing something like a squat that's creeping in. And therefore remember that when we're doing this exercise, we have a slight bend in the knees, of course, but we are not doing a squat as we go through that hip hinge. So the bend in the knee should remain reasonably static through the entirety of this exercise. And as we go to the bottom, we feel those hamstrings kick in, we feel tension in our back as we meet that end point, and then we're going to come back up again. So just like with the squat video, we can also use that tape test to stick some tape along our spine to act as an additional sensor when we're doing our hip hinge practice. That can be a wonderful tool to really get that connection between your brain, what it thinks is going on, and your lower back, what is actually going on, a little bit more in tune with one another. Another thing you can do to help make sure that you're based correctly, just like with the squat, is going to be lift your toes slightly so you feel a bit more planted into the ground, and then go through that hip hinging motion. And to the topic of that, I would always suggest with your hip hinges to make sure that you're doing them in barefoot. You don't want to be using trainers with an inch or more of wobble cushion underneath them, because you're going to be shaking all over the place. And what's worse is if you're wearing trainers with a large cushion on a mat, on a carpet, you're really making life much more difficult for yourself. So always do these bare feet on the ground, feel grounded and connected, because that is essential to doing this exercise when you're learning. So the next one to help you get this right is using a chair to kind of block your motion, because some people with the knees are going to go forwards. So if we stand nice and close to a chair of some description or a bench like over there, we can just make sure that when we're doing this, we're not squatting our knees into the chair. It'll just help make sure that we are actually doing that pure hip hinge and eliminate that squat hinge that I mentioned earlier. Finally, make sure that you are recording yourself, especially when you're learning this exercise. Pull your top up a little bit, maybe even do it with, a vest on or something tighter so you can see that lower back from the side, and make sure that there's no incorrect movements taking place. And again, that's something you can do from time to time as you progress on some of the harder variations of this exercise using bands and weights, etc. All of these exercises that we're going to cover now are going to be in the exercise library. So once you've had a play around with this video, you can come back to it in the future. You can always watch the variation that you're doing in the exercise library, follow along with it for 10 reps to make sure that you're getting it right at the right tempo, etc., and really get comfortable, making sure you're getting no pain when you're doing this movement. Because a lot of people struggle with this exercise quite so much, it's actually helpful to use a band in the beginning to make sure that we get the movement right. And just like other exercises, we're going to have this band on the front of the hip sockets over here, so that it is going to help us just here pull the hips backwards. It is the initiation of this hip movement that we're looking for the band to help us do, so that we can just focus on keeping our spine nice and steady. So we want the band to be waist height or just above. Then we pop the spine back and we'll get into position. So you can use the door anchors or something else like that, or even just have someone hold on to the band as long as you trust them nicely. And then we're going to hook this in around here, and we're going to move the band onto our hips, and we're going to walk away from the anchor point. And you can see the angle that the band is pulling me back at. And all I'm doing here at the moment is actually doing a glute thrust, essentially, to hold myself here. Now, what I need to do is hold my core nice and tight, hold my back muscle nice and tight, do a chest pop, and then simply allow the band to pull my hips backwards, keeping my knees nice and steady, and then come back up, and then allow the band to pull my hips backwards again. And as I get to the bottom here, my back muscles are engaged and tight, my hamstrings are tight and stretched, and I've finished the movement. And then I simply come back up, and then I allow myself to do it again. And this is one of those movements which you're going to have to do for repetitions just to help you get it so that this hip hinging motion is a really natural motion of the bum just initiating the movement by driving backwards. I'm not reaching down, okay? I'm not reaching forwards. I'm allowing my bum to move backwards as I do this so that I'm doing the movement safely rather than just rounding over like so, which is incorrect. You might actually find doing a couple of those before you do it in your workout is actually quite helpful to just re-trigger the beginners amongst you of that actual movement of the hips going backwards. Now, the next step we're going to do is we're going to have a support in front of us. So this could be a chair. It's something that we've got. So if we feel like we've gone a bit too far, because some of you are going to be quite acute, you can just support yourself and then come back up again. So it's just a safety here. And what we're doing is standing nice and close, kind of like we discussed with the chair earlier. We're going to run our hands down our thighs like so, and then come back up, down our thighs like so, and then come back up, down our thighs like so, and then come back up, down our thighs like so, and then come back up. And through here, the core should be nice and tight. The back muscles should be nicely engaged. Our chest should be popped, and our arms are just sliding down as our bum goes backwards. Some of you will be able to go a lot further than me. Others of you won't be able to go that far. A good cue is if you're one of the more flexible individuals that are doing this, if you can get your back to be horizontal, that's really as far as you need to be worrying about going for the foreseeable future. Don't try and push it even further than that for the time being, because that's often where movement really starts to leak into that lower back, and you're not really providing additional benefit at this early stage in the rehabilitation process. You can always move back into working on range of motion much later on once you've built some baseline level of strength. And quite equally, on the other hand, if you're only able to go to here, that's okay to start with. That's where you start. And gradually over time, you will find you can go a little bit further as your back gets stronger, as your movement gets more competent, and as you do some of the harder variations here. The final step here should really be the shadowed hip hinge. And that's where we just have our hands as if we're holding a weight later on. And we're just simply going down and back up. My knuckles should be going towards the point between my arches. So where my arches of my feet are going to meet, just in front of my shins down here, from the side down here, that's where my hands are going towards. The important thing that I am not doing is going like that, because that will catch some of you out later on as you progress the weights, and you're going to aggravate yourself if you do that. So once you've mastered the shadowing hip hinge, the basic movement itself, it's time to actually utilize resistance to build the strength and stability over the long term. And that's where we're going to be using the bands, which I'll demonstrate, the kettlebells, the dumbbells, the elevation, and the barbell to make sure that we can actually progress this thing for the long term. Because it's all well and good just doing it shadowing and getting the movement right. Now we need to challenge that movement to make sure we can keep the competence of that movement, even if we're using more in the way of resistance or load. And for the same reasons as it was in the squats, we're going to start out using a band and holding it nice and high. Reason being, the band is more forgiving. As you go lower down, you're a little bit more vulnerable, and therefore accidents can happen. But the variation in resistance on the bands just gives you that little bit more forgiveness when you are at the bottom in case you make errors. And it's important to remember at any moment, you can bail out of this by just letting go and coming back upright. So with that out of the way, we're going to pop this up nice and high, lock it into our chest, and then simply do the hip hinge. Down and back up, down and back up, down and back up, down and back up. As we've finished, lower the band down, we can step out and we're done. Just like with the squat, we can use the kettlebell and goblet position, hip hinge down and back up, down and back up, down and back up. We can also, for those of you that have kettlebells, use a kettlebell in the same way, holding it nice and high, nice and tight with your body in, posture engaged, coming down and back up, down and back up, down and back up. And then, of course, we've got the next step. The next option isn't really as relevant for the bands, but we can still use a kettlebell here. And we're doing the low hold, holding it between our legs. In this position, we simply squat down to pick it up and then go through that hip hinge, making sure that that weight is traveling to that same point we mentioned earlier between our arches as we go through this. And at the bottom of the rep, we should feel that our hamstrings are stopping us going any further and our back is solid and preventing our spine from rounding. We can also, of course, swap that kettlebell out depending on the equipment available and do exactly the same thing with the dumbbell in this position. And for those of you that require that extra range of motion, there's absolutely no problem with using an elevated platform to do exactly the same thing, depending on the size, shape of your dumbbells or kettlebells and the amount of range of motion that you personally have. And then, of course, we have the last variations. And these are going to be using a barbell. And you notice I've got the barbell set up on the side here. It's always easiest to set your barbell up first on a rack. It saves you having to mess around on the floor, loading plates onto that bar. And then all we're going to do is a couple of things here. I personally prefer having a double undergrip for similar reasons as we mentioned on previous videos with regards to limiting your grip strength. It's going to just hamper the rate at which you can increase the load, particularly useful for those of you that have a background in sport and have been a lot stronger prior to your injury. And then all we're doing in this position, nice and tall with the chest, and then lowering down and back up, down and back up, down and back up. And then we'd ordinarily put the bar on the floor or back on the rack if we're doing hip hinges. The next step, of course, is going to be moving to the actual deadlift motions. And this could be a conventional deadlift where we are in the parallel position and we're going to have a double over grip because we generally have to in this position. It's more difficult to have a double under. You can do it as well. And then we're here setting, coming up, and then coming down, and then coming up, and then coming down, and then coming up. We can also take the wide stance of deadlift where we come like so, feet a lot wider apart, much more of a straighter leg. There's going to be more hamstring and glute involvement in this particular one. And we set, get that bar nice and close over our shins. We come up like so. Again, double over grip we tend to have to do here, and then back down, and then up, and then back down, up, and then back down, up, and then back down. Whenever we're finishing these, to try and strip the weight, it's always handy. A little tip for you is that it might not be feasible, given the weights that you're using, to walk it all the way back to the rack. Instead, grab a small little weight and slide it underneath here so as to elevate the end that you're stripping. And that way, it just makes life a little bit easier for you than having to put it against the friction of the floor. There you have the full hip hinges. There's one final point that I didn't mention and we've covered on the marching bridges video, and that pertains to the cable pull through. And a big mistake that people make when they do deadlifts in particular, and you see a lot of guys in the gym doing this, or guys and ladies, is that when they come up, they do this movement at the very end and they go, oh, like so. Slight exaggeration, but a complete waste of time, and it's only going to jar your lower lumbar spine. The big problem with that is people think they're actually doing something that they're really not. And if you've got into this habit, you really need to watch out for it. Instead, as we discussed before, using the cable pull through is a way in which you can actually work that last bit of range of motion by placing these on the front of the hips and going backwards and back up again, backwards and back up again, focusing on hip extension rather than lower lumbar extension. And that way you can really squeeze the glutes. If you want to check that one out, go and watch the dedicated video on the cable pull through and follow along for 10 reps too. Hopefully you found this tutorial on the hip hinges helpful. Remember, you can come back to this at any time. Maybe as you progress, you need a refresher on the next steps, the next resistance equipment you should be using and how to do that. And you've always got that exercise library where you can follow along for 10 live reps together to make sure that you're doing these things at the right tempo with the right technique and just to refresh your memory.